excited for tonight. My good friend Jason Snell is here and will be demoing some cutting-edge music and technology, and I think I'll pass it over to him.
Thank you for being here. There's something really special about being able to present in my hometown. The first time I was in CSPS was in 1993, and they had a program then called Out of Bounds. And I was making videos in high school, art films, and CSPS gave me the opportunity to show I think 3 of them over time at different, I think Out of Bounds was a periodic event, and I was able to present. And it was, I reconnected with CSPS last year, and with Dan and Caleb Conduit, we started the Nouveau Synth Group, which is a free educational monthly that you can come to and learn about synthesizers and how to make electronic music. And then off of that, Pat Blinn started a DJ workshop as well, which is also a free educational monthly. So a lot of cool stuff at CSPS as we want to bring newer technologies, newer types of music, experimental technologies, and this certainly is the most experimental project that I've ever worked on. I'll give you just a brief overview of it, and then I'll perform, and typically after I perform, people have questions, and we have a wireless mic if you have any questions about what you saw or how the system worked, what I'm thinking about. If you can put the EEG on a dog, I usually get that question. We can try it. We can bring the dog up. Actually, let's just do that tonight. Just bring the dog up. So the system is this Muse EEG. So it's a commercially available EEG. It's very accessible. You can get a used one for like $125. It's a Bluetooth device, and so it transmits the brain data over Bluetooth to a custom iOS app I created, which then takes the electrical patterns, the electrical activity of my thoughts, and runs it through a series of algorithms and makes musical decisions. So I can insert notes, remove notes from a composition. I can control the overall shape, tone, and character of the music, the density of the music. There's a lot of different builds, and this is a particular one I'm performing tonight, which is off of a Electron Octatrack, which is it's kind of a super machine in terms of music boxes, but what I'm doing is I'm triggering different sound pieces and composing with these different pieces together, which you'll hear. And then what you'll see on screen is the live output of my brainwaves, and you'll see these different colored waves. So blue here is alpha. That one will go up as I go deeper into meditative states. When I'm in that space, it feels like the subconscious, so I'll dive into it. And then music, when I go into alpha space, becomes bassier and dreamier. And then another main one is delta, which will be the red, and that's an activated, awake, conscious type of brainwave. And those are the 2 main ones that I compose with, although I do use, where's theta? This is theta. For electronic music, gamma and beta over here are less significant. Depends on the type of music, but I've seen beta and gamma go up. For example, I put the system on an opera singer. Her beta and gamma were higher than everything else because she was singing, and I think that has to do with beta, is language and verbal. And gamma, she was doing the circular breathing, and I think gamma has to do with breath. So electronic music doesn't have vocals, so it's mostly alpha and delta, a little bit of theta. Enough Greek. Does anyone have any questions before I start? it's kind of an odd thing that I've gotten so used to making music with my brain that sometimes I forget a real basic thing before I start. Okay, then I'll get started.
I love you!
Thank you. I love you too. I don't know who you are. I mean, I probably do know who you are, I just can't see you because of the stage lights.
It's Bridget.
Oh, it's Bridget. I love you too, Bridget. questions. Let's get you a microphone. What's your name?
Oh, my name is Chris.
Thanks for being here.
Hi, everybody. So my first question, I guess, if you can just take us through overall, during that process, what was your thought process like? Were you thinking, were you thinking about specific thoughts? Were you trying to get into a meditative state? What was going on for you personally when that was occurring?
That's a great question. Initially, when I got the EEG, and the reason the music started to come back is it was picking up the electricity on the back of my neck. So I put it there. When I'm usually done, this system runs off the electricity in my body. And so if it's connected to my body, it starts to fire up. When I initially started developing this system, I thought, can I think of a C sharp or a D note and play keys on a keyboard? Can I think of a number or a specific sound, and will that come out? And it's not that direct. And the problem with that thinking for me was I was trying to take a model of a keyboard playing with my hands. And the thing is that this isn't a keyboard, it's my brain. And it's just a different instrument. And so over time, I've gotten more and more capable of controlling the electricity coming out of my brain. And there's different movements I can do through a psychic space. So when I close my eyes, it's a certain type of movement. So it's not necessarily a mood or a thought, but particularly tonight, I started to see it as almost like an electrical wave somewhere around here in my psychic space, and that I could transform it. And different times it has different visualizations. There's been other ones where I saw a type of circular pattern, and that was when the circle hit the outer point, that's when a kick or a bass would strike and go back. So it feels in a way like sculpting, like shaping the sounds with a psychic space. The actual medium in which I'm composing in is fluid, because the brain has a lot of fluid in it, and it's electricity moving through fluid. And so a lot of the movements feel like waves moving through a pool. And that whole space is the instrument. So it's not a keyboard or a guitar or a drum. It's a brand new instrument and a different way of composing. So that's been my challenge of how to describe something that's an instrument that very few people worldwide have used. Did they answer that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Hey, Jason.
Hey, I have a question about kind of what we were seeing visually
Yeah.
On the screen as you were composing this. Let me make sure I understand correctly. The alpha is more when you're in a transitive or in a meditative state.
Correct.
And the red lines were more in an alert and awake state. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So I was really paying attention during the composition to see what was happening with the music and then when things would go in a certain direction. And I expected to see at times like things that maybe would even make you more alert because of where the music was headed, but yet that wave was low.
The red and the purple.
Yeah, and it didn't play out the way I expected it to. Can you kind of talk on that a little bit?
Sure. On the system, there's a level of reactivity to the brain waves, and what's being sent to the screen. This particular build, this is about 1.5, has more of a smoothing agent on it, and there's other builds like 1.9, which is quite volatile, so it reacts very quickly. So it's a bit of that water or fluid metaphor in that you hit the water, it takes a little bit of time for the waves to hit. Now I can turn the sensitivity off on this system, but the sound comes out a little bit too volatile with these particular sounds. When my eyes are closed, the blue one is usually the dominant wave. And a lot of it is just based on, am I listening to the sound? Because when I listen to music, my alpha goes up. And what happens is a biofeedback system. So as I listen to the music that my brain is shaping, then that comes back in and it creates this loop and it gets deeper and deeper. With the brighter sounds, it could be something as simple as just hearing something in the room, or thinking about, what if it breaks on the next song? Like a worry will come up and the music will wake up. Or I can start to open my eyes and let stimulation in, and that will wake it up. In terms of specific sounds, not correlating, I would have to see it specifically. I think that's why I record these, is to be able to review it. Was there a particular point in the set where you noticed that the visual didn't seem to be...
Just at these moments where, things were really swelling and then something really aggressive would come in.
Yeah.
That it's like I expected that red line to just peak higher, but it wasn't. It was the blue line that was peaking, and the other was riding underneath it. And
Yep.
and you kind of explained that a little bit ago, that you're still in a meditative state, so I would get that.
Sure. Did all the waves go up, or were they all consistent, including the blue?
I can't remember.
You can't recall. Okay. Because sometimes there's certain movements or sounds where all of them will go up quite dramatically and then dip back down.
There did seem to be a correlation.
Yep. Because it is the electrical output of the overall brain, and it takes certain methods to isolate certain bands or certain regions to have one go up and the others not. But it is the actual signal that's coming out of the brain is a broadband signal, and the way that you get those different regions, alpha, beta, delta, is just by applying high-pass and low-pass filters to create different sections on the electrical signal. So that broadband signal becomes 5 distinct channels, and each channel has its own decibel level. So if there's an electrical surge going through the whole broadband signal, often a lot of the signals will go up. A lot of what I look at in this system isn't necessarily the decibel level of a particular one, but I look at the relationship between the different ones, particularly delta and alpha, because when alpha goes above delta, it's often, that's when it feels like I slip underneath the water. And then when my delta comes back up, I come back out of the water. That's probably the best metaphor for it. Yes?
So the
Let's get your mic.
So the numbers on the bottom, are those supposed to represent hertz, or
They're decibel levels.
they're decibel levels? Already?
Yep, they're decibel levels of that particular range. This is why I have other graphics. I've got the decibel level, or the frequencies for you. So delta is the lowest one, and what's interesting about delta is it's one of the slowest hertz of the entire frequency spectrum. So it can go from 0.1, 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second, and delta can go up to about 3.5. So it's a very big, slow wave. Theta is the next range above it, 4 to 8. Alpha is right in the middle, 8 to 12. What's interesting about alpha is it's actually a suppressive wave. So the other waves are more of an active state, and alpha actually reduces the amount of stimulation coming from reality into your brain. So when your alpha is up, it's you're closing down and shutting things out, like in a meditation, or if you're really focused on music. Alpha also works spatially. I spoke with a neuroscientist at the University of Iowa. So if I'm at a noisy restaurant and I'm trying to listen just to you, and I'm trying to tune out the rest of the noisy restaurant, my alpha waves will go up everywhere except where I'm looking. And so it tries to suppress the signal coming in spatially in my brain from the rest of the noisy room, except where I'm focusing on the person I'm talking to. So alpha is interesting in that it's a suppressive wave. And then it gets up into higher waves, beta and gamma. And gamma actually starts to get into the audible range. So brain waves, if you look at the frequency spectrum, if if you look at the frequency spectrum, really far down on the bottom, you have brainwaves, and it goes to about 44 hertz. And it's got the same list there. And then next to it are sound waves. And so we can hear about to 20 hertz, which is really bassy. And it can go up to 20 kilohertz. And then dogs can hear up to about 45. And so they can hear higher pitches than us. So this is the highest, tinniest sound that we can hear, and then dogs can hear up a bit more. And what's interesting about the frequency spectrum in terms of concept is the very fundamentals of what we perceive are brainwaves in terms of frequency. And then you move into sound waves, which go up to 20,000. And then what's interesting, if you go all the way up the scale, up here on the same frequency spectrum, you start to get light and color. And so those are really fast waves. So in a way, if you take a color and you pitch it down 40 octaves, you get a sound. So like a C is green, A is orange. So it's a really phenomenal way to look at the frequency spectrum, that when I look at something, it's just a frequency really sped up. It's a brainwave that's sped up, and it's a sound that's sped up, and that becomes the visual frequencies. My mind blew up when I saw that chart for the first time. Yeah.
Hi, Jason.
I don't.
I gotta say, this is pretty fascinating stuff, man. I'm glad I got to come see you tonight. But I have a question for when you're actually composing, when you're up there, in your mind, do you have like trigger points or cues, let's say like a certain memory, or maybe like a person that would maybe cause your composition to change as you're doing your thing?
It's a very present moment. I tend not to get too much lost into the past during the performances. If my brain starts to shift even a little bit into the future or drift, I can hear it. The best way I can trigger things, and this has gotten better and better over time. So I presented at St. Ambrose last night in Davenport, the university. The same thing happened where I was able to start in that visual kind of seeing this spectrum in front of me and moving into it and being able to hit kicks. And so it's how do you describe a nonverbal invisible movement in your head? But it's a nonverbal invisible movement in my head. And it's kind of a... so I am developing that skill to be able to very specifically, and I when I was doing it last night, it was a different sound kit. It's a shorter one. I was doing it and I was like, oh, it happened again. Oh, it happened again. Oh, it happened again. I was like, oh, it's working. Because the first time I put it on, I was like, let's see what comes out. So in terms of shaping the sound, being able to control it, it's gotten more and more finessed. But it hasn't been a particular emotion. It's really psychically moving into the realm of how do I manipulate electricity in my brain. And I wish it was as simple as like think of a guitar lick and like it comes out of the speakers. And maybe at some point the system will get there. Yeah. Yes. Scott.
So, as an old engineer, I'm kind of looking at some of the stuff, and then what you've told me is quite fascinating. Have you tried recording this from an audio standpoint and a visual standpoint, such that you're not listening to it and watching it while it's being recorded?
So just putting the EEG on and recording the data without hearing the music or seeing it?
Yes. And then there's a follow-up question. Have you done any experiential reading while that's being recorded, or watching something while it's being recorded, or having somebody with you when it's being recorded, that kind of stuff? Just curious.
So the first part of the question, have I put it on and recorded the data and reviewed the data later? I think I've always had at least a readout of the data that I was aware of, because I have tested different activities. I'm guessing I would be video recording myself with it on and then review it. Otherwise, how would I review it, line up the data? I have put it on an opera singer, and she just sang several songs in German and Italian, and I also simultaneously was screen recording the waves and put together the audio from her singing and the video of her singing in footage next to the waves. And I could see the ups and downs, and like I mentioned, her beta and gamma were higher than anything I've done with the electronic music. In terms of experiments, to back up a little bit with that question, sometimes I also have audience members put it on and I watch them. And so that's a case where I'm not producing the sound or music, but I'm able to observe. So I've learned a lot it's usually more in an academic setting. So in terms of experiments, probably the one that's been the most interesting out of, answering emails or talking or coding, the system and doing new installs and then hearing the output. There's been a lot of Q&A with that. But the thing that's probably been the most interesting is taking a nap with it. And so put it on, I'll lie down, and I'll hear the music, and then I'll drift away and it gets quieter and quieter. And then you have kind of those pre-dream, those weird visions where it's like, like a dog with an EEG, or, like some sort of weird thing comes to your brain, you're like, oh, that's weird. But it's getting into dreamscape, so you don't think it's weird unless you kind of notice it. When one of those images comes up, I then hear it. And what's cool is it's almost like this rope being tossed into the abyss, where I've got this lifeline back to consciousness as I'm drifting into dreams, because the sound will anchor, and then at some point I lose consciousness and don't hear the music as well. But it's been a fascinating way to explore the stages as going into a sleep state, because I have an anchor there that is responding to the formation of dreams. Background.
Kind of a follow-up on what you were just talking about. Have you gotten into full REM sleep, or recorded a whole night's worth of sleep to where you're actually in full sleep rather than that stage right before you're dreaming?
I haven't, and mostly because the actual headband, if it gets knocked, or if I press against it or roll in my sleep, I'd likely lose connection. That's one of the challenges with it. I know a lot of sleep studies have been done with EEGs. Were you saying while listening to the music, or just doing a full night's sleep and see what the data is?
I mean both. Kind of like what you were saying too, where I feel like your data is going to be, dependent on those outside variables. So I guess either way.
I know there has been a lot of sleep studies with people. They have the full, I've heard they actually super glue it to people's heads so they stay fixed. I'm not going to super glue this thing to my head. So there is a lot of data about the different waves. I think one of the things that's curious to me is in those sleep studies, they say delta goes really high, which is interesting to me because delta is so much of a stress activation consciousness when I'm using it. And at the end of the day, it's figuring out how to learn from this system so I can better compose, and the better I can compose, the more I learn about the brain. So it becomes a cyclical experience with the system. I think a related thing that I'm interested in doing in the near future is having multiple people with EEGs composing simultaneously and seeing if simpler sounds than this, but to see if the sounds start to harmonize, or if the ups and downs of the brain, as they're both listening to the output, if they start to sync up. And a somewhat related but interesting is that when I was in Berlin presenting a sound festival, one of the promoters she has synesthesia, so she would, when she would hear sound, she would see visuals, particularly when she closed her eyes, like very intense visuals. So I asked her if I could meet up with her, and I met with her and her friends at her flat, and we put the system on her. She closed her eyes and went into a really intense visual experience, and what really called into question was, what is the cause and what is the effect? So her brain is making a sound, and then she sees a visual that's a response to the sound, or is the visual forming, and that's what creates the brain electricity, which then makes the sound. What starts to happen with the system with biofeedback is that the cause and effect are getting closer and closer and closer, where it's not a linear direction anymore, but it's more of this communication happening with events that are happening so close that it upends the idea of cause and effect. And so is the brain something that perceives and accepts information, or is the brain something that creates, or simultaneously? Yes?
I don't need Mike.
All right.
I was actually thinking about the whole synesthesia thing because of how it relates to this chart you have up there.
Yeah.
But do you foresee or anticipate any therapeutic or medical applications of what you're doing down the road?
Certainly. I mean, when I took those naps, it was a really beautiful experience and it could be a nap or like a yoga shavasana, of diving down into a trance, having this anchor is similar to hypnosis, really, where you have an anchor as you're going into a more subconscious, deeper state of the mind, and there's something to keep you from falling asleep, which a hypnotherapist would be the person. But with this, it would be the sounds of your brain and being able to navigate different places. What I haven't tried is having a dialogue with someone as I dive down, or someone else dives down, and see if different parts of the brain could be accessed through guidance, but increased because both the guide and the person going through could hear where their brain is.
The reason I asked is I have sleep apnea. I just had a sleep study done a couple of weeks ago on it, and when you were talking about the beta waves peaking, the reason that happens is anyone who has sleep apnea is because we dog with oxygen. So our body says, no, you can't go any deeper in sleep. You've got to wake back up to do that. So, so anything that could help certain people, train their brain responses, avoid certain things. Be good therapeutic for schizophrenics and various things like that. But they learn what parts of their brain are doing it, because we take so much, music can have such a profound impact on us. And that the ability to associate a certain brain function with a certain musical tone or musical phrase, that could open up so many possibilities.
I've been studying the brain more recently. There's a book by Kurzweil called Create a Mind, and he's talking about really the strength of the brain as opposed to the computer. The computer's good at computing, just like crunching numbers, the stuff that the brain gets really bored with. What the brain's learning is fundamentally based on is sequences. And so, like, we know the alphabet because we know the sequence but saying the alphabet backwards is difficult. We could read it, if we put it down, we could read it backwards easily, but to actually say the alphabet backwards is tricky. And so there's different sequences and patterns that the brain goes through therapeutically that would be destructive. When I feel this, then I think this, and then I do that. And if there could be a visual and audio cue for that track, which is destructive, and start to rewire it into, when I feel this, actually I think this instead, then I do that instead. So there's the strength of patterns and sequences and trying to rewire that. And music is inherently sequences and patterns. Are there any hands? Is there one back there?
Yeah, I probably need one. I don't have a big booming voice either.
Can we get him a mic?
sorry.
Thanks, Trevor.
So it's interesting to sit here and listen to what you're doing, right? And I can appreciate the musical side of that. What I'm struggling with is to understand how you impart things onto it. So, like, not understanding what the bass sound is before you add the waves to it is hard for me to register, right? My engineering brain is going totally wild with this, right? So is there or what other people, throwing it on somebody else and seeing what they, hearing what the bass sound is without, and then what other people that aren't trained to go and mess with the water.
So more of the technical details.
Yeah.
Yeah. This particular build, like I said, I think this one's 1.5. This one is sending MIDI. Are you familiar with MIDI?
Not really.
MIDI is a language in which drum machines can talk to synthesizers that can talk to sequencers. It's musical instrument digital interface. And it's a way essentially to send sheet music from machine to machine. So it's in notes, but it can also do, you can turn the knobs on one machine and it'll affect the filters or the envelopes on another machine if the MIDI is being routed. So technically what's happening is I'm taking my brain electricity and converting it into MIDI signals in order to control this particular sampler. It could also be routed to a synthesizer or a drum machine, and then the sounds would come from that machine, but still MIDI coming out. So essentially it's electricity to digital sheet music. This system is not as responsive as 1.9, and 1.9 is, I can only load one song at once with 1.9, and so it's just it's a shorter performance. I've only been doing that in an academic environment so far, and this one is more long form. What I'm doing is that there's a looping sequencer in my iOS app, and when I move through different mental spaces and hit those triggers, I'm inserting a note into that looping sequencer, or I can take notes out. So it's me interacting with the looping sequencer with my brain. And then the nature of the sound, the character of the sound, over time, I'm using, they're called CC, it's continuous controller. It's also called control changes inaccurately, but that's a common term with MIDI. Essentially, I'm turning the knobs on the machine with my brain. And those are technically CC changes, and they go from 0 to 127. And that's changing the filters, changing the effects sends, so the reverb, or if there's a delay, if there's a delay on the kick. All of those are being altered mostly by the relationship between my alpha and delta. So instead of mapping it directly to alpha or directly to delta, I'm always looking at those two and determining which one is higher and by what percentage in recent history. Does that help? Sort of. Each build gets more responsive and nuanced to the brainwaves, so I'm doing more of mapping exact brainwaves to exact sounds. And I'm trying to think if there's a good way to explain it without going into a deeper MIDI lesson. I mean, do you want to do a MIDI lesson? I could do a similar set with my hands, but I'd be turning knobs the whole time. And what this is instead is I'm able to turn the knobs with wirelessly with it's like telekinesis. I'm able to turn the knobs with my brain. The other thing is inserting notes. I would press a button on the machine as it's looping, and so I'm inserting notes rather than touching the machine. I'm inserting notes or removing notes with my brain with different brain activity. So that's this particular build. We can chat more afterwards too if you want. Yes?
I have a good question based on that. So basically
Yeah.
what you're doing is in the program and what you develop, it recognizes the signals you're sending, and then it triggers things. And it's, like you use the example of turning knobs physically, but you're kind of
program this to ensure the knobs based on what is happening for you. Is that wrong? or
Yes.
right?
So, for example, when I dive deeper into subconscious, that's like turning the knob.
Gotcha.
With this particular system, it's turning knobs in multiple channels. And then when I wake up, that's turning other knobs the other direction.
Gotcha.
So in a simplistic way, that's what's happening.
I think we have one question right here, and then you'll be around
I'll
afterwards.
be around,
and
so
we'd
yeah,
be happy to answer any
more
questions. So, yeah,
your
we'll
questions.
get this question in and go out there.
Thanks, son.
So my question is about electrical interference. Because we've heard a lot about, cell phone interference and all that with our brains and our neurology. And, just ambient interference. Have you ever had any kind of experience with that? Or what do you think about that and the effect on our brainwaves? To me, it seems like these are electrical impulses, and here we are on the spectrum. What's going on?
Yep. I'll jump back to this try again. In between light and color, we've got radio waves, microwaves, infrared waves. There's a ton of waves happening in the electromagnetic spectrum that we don't see. We see just a really limited band here, but there's just as many waves. So if we were built different biologically, there would be all these different colors or waves that we could visually see if our eyes were different. So yeah, there are waves. I have had interference twice now. So once was at a show in New York, and it was a rough show because I didn't know why the system wasn't working. And it actually happened again tonight. So in the beginning, I was having trouble. The sound was getting, a lot of my music sounds like that anyways, but there was a particular, in the beginning it was stretching out because there was some sort of interference happening. And so that's why I was touching the app. I was relaunching it, and I relaunched it twice and it started working normally. And it certainly feels like it's some sort of interference happening. In terms of thoughts on waves, the abundance of waves of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, of all the waves that are going through our space. If you think about a pure sound, it's a very clean sound. It's just just a pure tone. It's very clear, it's very concise, and thoughts can be clear. And so as there's more waves going through the space, I certainly could see that those waves start to conflict and start to make the signal much more complex and make it harder to focus. So scientifically, I don't know that, but theoretically, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jason. Let's put together one more presentation.